This isn't how we usually picture salmon. And these images aren't what the salmon industry wants us to see. Captured on a salmon farm this April in the west of Scotland, the fish look diseased. Their skin has been eaten away by sea lice. The man who filmed them up close, Corin Smith, diver, photographer and activist.
I'm not ideological about farming of animals. You know, I'm the son of a hill sheep farmer. But anyone who looks at open cage salmon farming at any level, it's obviously a grossly unsustainable industry. Fish have their skin eaten away from their face, massive lesions, and then the fish that are sick are just left to die a long, slow, agonising death until they sink to the bottom of the cage. There's nothing about that that's acceptable.
He swims alongside the fish with underwater cameras and sends drones up over the farms.
What I do is the equivalent of taking a walk in the countryside, which you're allowed to do in Scotland wherever you want, passing a field of sheep or cattle and leaning over the fence and taking some pictures of animal cruelty.
But while he's been monitoring salmon farmers, it turns out the salmon industry has been monitoring him. So where did you find this device then?
So I was just changing a wheel that had burst, and I took off the spare tyre, and tucked up right underneath here was a little black box stuck to the subframe. Someone had to have surveilled me for a long time to figure out when they could put the tracker on.
Corin has reported this GPS tracker to the police. He's never been able to establish who put the device under his car or whether it was placed there by a salmon company, but he says he has no other enemies. And using subject access requests, which allow you to find out if a company is holding information on you, he's discovered a salmon farming company was spying on him. Corin Smith recently managed to obtain an intelligence report that had been compiled about him by a private investigator. Much of it is redacted. It includes photographs of his house. Investigators carried out searches of his financial activities and checks to see if he'd ever appeared in court. The report concludes Corin Smith is, quote, unfortunately calm, credible and personable. Nevertheless, it recommends surveilling him to find out who he's meeting, and says, as per discussions with the salmon company, investigators will attempt to gain intelligence on any financial difficulties, potentially by adopting false identities to obtain sensitive information. The industry body Salmon Scotland say they're proud of how their fish are looked after and that the industry is transparent and open. They accuse Corin Smith of harassing and misrepresenting them.
We work very closely with Police Scotland on the activists who attack our industry because they want to close us down. What we're not prepared to put up with is the intimidation, the smears, the misrepresentation and the harassment of our people.
What lengths are you prepared to go to stop Mr. Smith?
We'll work with Police Scotland in the law and through the law of the land to make sure that we protect our people working on our sea farms, but we do that absolutely in line and in accordance with the law of the land.
What about hiring private detectives to surveil him? Who did that?
I don't know anything about that. Mr. Smith wrote to the lawyers of one of our salmon companies saying that unless he received money, he would go to the media. If his interests are in fish health or in people, why is he asking for money?
Corin Smith showed us this letter. In it, he asks for a legal settlement, which would involve the company stopping their surveillance and paying him financial compensation. He's not the only environmental activist apparently being monitored by private investigators. Campaigner and composer Garrard, seen here in the bow tie next to Charlotte Church at a protest, discovered that oil giant BP commissioned intelligence on him.
I was at the train station on my way to BP's AGM. I later found out they had a photo from the CCTV footage. It feels really uncomfortable to know they're taking that kind of personal interest in me. We know, for example, that the police have undertaken surveillance on environmental campaigners and gone undercover to do that, and it's been extremely difficult to hold them to account. And there's potentially even less accountability when it's these private companies.
BP say they support people's right to demonstrate peacefully, But they've sometimes been targeted by disruptive actions. So they've used a risk consultancy to monitor material in the public domain. Of course, every company, every industry is keen to protect their commercial interests. But are private detectives and the methods they use appropriate to keep environmental campaigners at bay?
Well, joining me now is the activist and researcher Dr. Evelyn Lubers, who's written a book about corporate and police spying on activists, and the co-leader of the Green Party, Carla Denyer. Welcome both to the programme. Dr. Evelyn Lubers, how widespread is this use of private detectives?
Well, it's of course very difficult to put a number on that, because these kind of operations are supposed to take place in secret, and unless they're exposed, you don't know about them. But my PhD research involved collecting quite a few stories that had been leaked, and plans, in fact, by large corporations, not only to spy on activists and on campaigners, but to actively do something with the information they get to undermine campaigners, which you clearly saw in the report you just showed.
So what, you're not surprised by the activities or the alleged activities of a salmon company that we showed in our film there, for instance?
No, I'm not. It has in fact, all the details that I've shown in my book as well. It is the cooperation with the police. I have to say that private detectives who engage in this kind of activities are very often former police officers. And even so, the officers that went undercover or worked for the units that went undercover into activist group for years and years. So there is indeed a close cooperation of exchange of information between the police and the spy cops units, as we call them. And you can clearly see that it all is to sort of to engage with the agenda of large corporations. The police is more often on the hand of the large corporations than the activists who campaign for change. But we all know that there's no change possible without protest first.
Well, let me come on to that point about the links to policing in just a second. But let me bring in Carla Denyer. Carla Denyer, essentially, nothing illegal is taking place here. It's perfectly legal to hire a private detective and to research people who are criticising your company or your industry.
I don't know if it's the right thing to do, though. And as Evelyn pointed out, campaigners play a vital role in a healthy democracy, frankly, in exposing whether it's environmental crimes or poor workplace practices. Indeed, it's often campaigners and investigative journalists that have forced businesses and governments to clean up their act. These are people who are working in the public interest, exposing threats to public health, protecting habitats and wildlife. And sadly, as you were saying, it's not just businesses. Spying on campaigners and activists has been routinely used by the police as well. Even my colleague, Green member of the House of Lords, Jenny Jones, was labelled and monitored by the police as a domestic extremist while serving as a London Assembly member.
Well, we are only just finding out about some of the historic undercover policing activities through the ongoing inquiry. Is it a matter of concern for you that perhaps we might never find out about what's gone on in the private sector?
Yes, it is a matter of concern for me. I think the revelations that have come out in your report today are appalling, but sadly not surprising. Every few years, a story like this comes out about a private company or the police spying covertly on campaigners and whistleblowers who are just trying to raise the alarm about illegal or immoral practices. So I'm particularly worried because on top of what we've just learnt today, on top of what businesses are up to, the Conservative government is, through its policing bill, which is going through Parliament now, trying to take away the basic democratic right to protest to make it even harder to raise that alarm. And so Greens are doing everything we can to stop this. Our Green peers in the House of Lords, Natalie Bennett and Jenny Jones, are pushing hard to secure Labour's support, to get them to oppose these changes. They're really an unprecedented assault on the fundamental right to protest, which is an essential part of our democracy.
OK, thank you, Carla Denny. I want to move back to Dr. Lubers. How difficult is it for people to find out if they are being spied on? I mean, we spoke to 2 individuals there, but essentially it's quite difficult to find out what's actually going on, isn't it?
It is indeed. The only thing you can do is try and file a subject access request to see if a company has any files on you. But other than that, there's no legal framework whatsoever that that controls private detectives. It's incredibly difficult to find out what undercover officers do, what the police does, but there's even less accountability for private investigators and their work.
So, Carla Denny, is there a role for regulation of private detectives here?
I think there is, yes, and the Green Party would seek much firmer regulation of businesses in terms of the way they act and the problems that the way they're behaving might be causing. So in this case, the animal welfare of the salmon, but also regulating in terms of how they can employ private investigators, what they're allowed to do with that data.
Carla Denny and Dr. Evelyn Lubers, thank you very much, both of you, for joining us.